A veteran of 6 wars, a service history spanning 3 decades, over 11,000 vehicles manufactured between 23 series produced variants. Outgunned, outclassed, and largely obsolete, this was the vehicle the Soviet people relied on to blunt Nazi Germany's armoured spearhead in 1941. This was the T26. In 1928, the British engineering company Vickers Armstrong Limited produced the first Vickers Mark E, commonly referred to as the Vickers 6-ton tank. The Type A configuration included twin turrets mounted side by side, each mounting a 303 Vickers machine gun. The vehicle was protected by between 3/4 of an inch to an inch of riveted steel plate and was powered by a 90 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Puma engine. Unfortunately for Vickers, the British Army was not interested, apparently due to questions about the reliability of the novel twin-bogie suspension design. In 1930, however, Vickers had their first buyer, the USSR. The Soviets bought 15 Type A vehicles, as well as a production license to start manufacturing their own copies of the tank. The purchased vehicles would be designated V-26 and would enter service in the Red Army on the 13th of February 1931. The first mass-produced vehicles, designated T26 Model 1931, were very similar to the Vickers design, but with some small differences. The Soviet engineers had decided to increase the height of the turret to allow larger vision slits, and had modified the turret fronts to fit the Soviet DT 7.62mm light machine gun. Not all Model 1931 vehicles mounted 2 machine guns, however. Some featured French PS-1 or Soviet B-3 37mm howitzers housed in one of the turrets for increased infantry support capabilities. The Red Army had carefully copied the Armstrong Siddeley Puma engine, somewhat simplifying it to allow for the mass production of the vehicle. Around 2,000 twin-turreted T-26 vehicles were built overall, and many were converted to other purposes without ever seeing combat. The T-26 Model 1933 enjoyed the largest production run out of any T-26 variant, and for good reason. This upgraded vehicle did away with the twin turret design and included a single, cylindrical, 2-man turret, mounting a Soviet-made 45mm high-velocity anti-tank gun that was capable of muzzle velocities of over 800 meters per second. This modern, high-caliber, high-velocity gun was immensely powerful for the time period, capable of destroying any contemporary tank with ease, even at significant range. Secondary armament consisted of a coaxial DT machine gun with an additional machine gun on an external anti-aircraft mount. In 1935, another machine gun was to be added in a ball mount on the rear of the turret. It was clear that the Soviets had created a capable, well-rounded vehicle that was simple enough to be mass-produced by their vast industrial machine. It was a good compromise between speed, armour and firepower, while remaining versatile and relatively cheap, and it was soon to get its first taste of combat in Western Europe. In late 1936, civil war erupted in Spain between the Republican government and Franco's nationalist rebels. By the end of 1936, the USSR had sent 50 T-26 tanks to the Republican army, along with crew, munitions, and spare parts. A week later, General Franco's nationalists would receive their first shipment of German Panzer I vehicles, while the Italians had begun to provide Franco with CV-33 tankettes even earlier. This would be the real test of the Soviet design, and it would perform extremely well in the Spanish campaign. The German and Italian tanks were only armed with machine guns, so had no way of destroying the T-26, while the Soviet vehicle's 45mm gun would make short work of any target it came across. Ultimately, the USSR would provide a total of 281 T-26 tanks, all being the single-turret Model 1933. These vehicles would be used by both sides in almost all battles in the Spanish Civil War, with approximately 40% of all T-26 vehicles falling into the hands of the nationalists by the end of the conflict. The experience gained in Spain fighting Republican T-26s was extremely valuable to the Germans, allowing them to develop anti-tank tactics and alter their future tank designs with the T-26 in mind. The conflict did, however, expose the extremely thin armour of the vehicle, being easily penetrated by German and Italian anti-tank weaponry. In 1938, the Soviet designers upgraded the vehicle once again, adding a conical turret with a higher armor protection than that of the Model 1933. This was known as the Model 1938. Following poor performance in the Soviet-Japanese border conflicts of late 1938, and proving vulnerable to the Japanese Type 95 light tank and its 37mm main gun, the vehicle was upgraded again to Model 1939 standard, featuring sloped hull armour underneath the turret with an extra 20mm of steel plate. This would prove to be the final version of the T26 tank, and nearly 2,000 units would be produced in total of the Model 1938 and Model 1939 variants before being withdrawn from production in 1940. These improved vehicles would get their baptism of fire in the frozen, dense forests of Finland before the end of the year, in what would later be known as the Winter War. On the 30th of November 1939, the USSR invaded Finland. 500,000 Red Army soldiers poured across the Finnish border, accompanied by thousands of tanks, the majority of which were T26s. The Leningrad military district alone had 848 T26 tanks at the beginning of the war. These vehicles ranged from older twin-turret designs to modern 1939 models, along with the flamethrower variant KHT-26. The attack was largely a disaster for the Soviets. Due to Stalin's purges in 1937 and 1938, many Red Army officers were new, inexperienced, or simply unfit for leadership. The Soviet tanks were painted in standard olive drab and the men dressed in regular khaki uniforms, standing out against the bright white backgrounds of the Finnish border regions. Most vehicles had no radios, and many didn't even have intercoms. This, along with the Red Army's failure to implement organised combined arms tactics, meant that Soviet tank crews were commonly told to attack Finnish defences head-on with little support. The tanks quickly became isolated and were destroyed by the defenders using anti-tank guns, 20mm anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails, and other improvised anti-tank devices. Groups of Soviet soldiers and their supporting tanks were often ambushed by Finnish troops, capturing many T-26 vehicles and pressing them into Finnish service to fight against the invading Soviets. By the end of the war in early 1940, the Red Army had lost 930 T-26 tanks in Karelia alone, more than they had invaded with in November 1939. The Winter War had sullied the reputation of the mighty Red Army worldwide and had proved that thinly armoured tanks such as the T-26 were now completely obsolete as assault vehicles despite the upgrades. The decision was then made to cease production in 1940 and to shift the focus of Russia's industry to more modern, capable designs, such as the new T-34 medium tank. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941 took the Red Army completely by surprise. The largest invasion force in the history of warfare rolled across the border along a 2,900-kilometre front, including 3 million men, 600,000 motor vehicles, and supported by over 2,500 aircraft. The attack was spearheaded by around 3,600 tanks and 3,000 other armoured fighting vehicles of the German panzer divisions, who were already highly experienced after previous campaigns in 1939 and 1940. The Red Army had an estimated 11,000 tanks of its own to combat the invasion. The 5 Soviet Western military districts had about 3,100 T-26s of all models in working order when the invasion began, making up 40% of Soviet tank strength in its frontline districts. Operation Barbarossa, the German codename for the invasion, had incredible success in the summer of 1941. The momentum and scale of the attack had completely destroyed the Soviet command structure within hours, meaning an organised Soviet defence plan or counter-offensive was almost impossible. The majority of T-26 tanks in the front line had been destroyed by the end of the summer of 1941. Most of these losses were due to German airstrikes and artillery, tearing apart the thinly armoured vehicles and causing unprecedented destruction among the disorganised Soviet tank formations. A large number of T-26 vehicles were lost to mechanical failures over the same time period, with the antiquated design proving unable to cope with the mechanical and logistical stresses involved in such a large-scale conflict. The T-26 did see some success against invading German tanks, however. Despite being inferior to the modern German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IV tanks in most aspects, the Soviet 45mm gun could still penetrate the armour of these vehicles at close range. The Panzer I and Panzer II, along with the Czech-built Panzer 35T and Panzer 38T, made up over 50% of the German tank strength in June 1941, and were much easier prey for the T-26 with their thin armour and relatively low-caliber guns. Despite the high losses experienced by the Red Army, the T-26 still formed a significant part of the Soviet armoured force by late 1941, with other tanks arriving from inner districts and the Far East to bolster existing numbers. T-26 tanks participated in the Battle of Moscow in October 1941 and were instrumental in the liberation of Rostov in December of the same year. The vehicle was also used in the northern Leningrad front against invading Finnish and German forces. In one well-documented report, 3rd Lieutenant Mikhail Ivanovich Yakovlev and his crew destroyed 2 pillboxes, 3 anti-tank guns, 4 machine gun nests, 3 mortars and an ammunition depot, causing the Germans over 200 casualties in just a few days. Yakovlev's T-26 was hit 9 times but was never taken out of action. He would go on to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union award for his actions. The vehicle continued to be used throughout 1942 from the Barents Sea to the Black Sea. The T-26 saw combat in Kharkov, Stalingrad and the Caucasus, in steadily decreasing numbers as destroyed vehicles were replaced with the more capable T-34. Rear echelon and reserve troops continued to use the T-26, and some tanks were reported to have fought as late as July 1944, helping to break the Leningrad blockade. Outside of Red Army service, the T-26 was present in many foreign nations' inventories for years to come. Spain continued to operate over 100 vehicles, which would remain in Spanish service until 1954, when they were replaced with the M47 Patton. The last T-26 was retired from Finnish Army service in 1961, having been used as training vehicles in the years prior. Chinese vehicles saw use by both sides of the Chinese Civil War, some being taken to Taiwan in 1950 by the government forces and retired at a later date. The vehicle was also bought by the Turkish, and captured tanks were used by the Germans and Romanians. There are over 40 surviving examples of the T-26 presented in various museums across the globe. This is a testament to the huge usage, influence, and production numbers of a vehicle that may have been obsolete by 1941, but was arguably the best tank design of the interwar period and influenced many tank designs for years to come. Often fighting with the odds stacked against it, the T-26 will go down in the history books as one of the most important tanks of the 20th century, and it is important that its part in tank warfare is never understated. Thank you so much for putting up with my bad microphone, my bad editing, and my bad accent. It would really help me if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll hopefully be making more of these soonish. I'd really appreciate any feedback you had if you could just leave that down in the comments. Cheers.